Okay, so we're at the machine, but before we sew, I want to show you how I put my Seam Sew Easy guide on here. So with the instructions, it shows how you can cut out this little square. And after you've done that, I like to use a ruler. And with each machine, there's some kind of a straight lines somewhere that you can line up with the grid to make sure things are straight. But the most important thing you want to know is this center line right here needs to line up with the needle. So what I do is I just put my ruler right where the needle goes, and that kind of helps me to center it. Then I use washi tape so that I can just remove it and it doesn't leave a residue. I can remove it when I need to pack up when I finish sewing, or to lift up to change my bobbin, or anything like that. So these three lines right here are going to help us sew the blocks accurately without having to mark onto the fabric when I do my easy corner triangles. So the first block that we're going to sew is the checkerboard star that I have laid out here on the design board. And basically, when I look at a block, I just want to sew all of the small sections into squares or rectangles so that they can all be sewn together. So these will end up being a square. This is already a square, but we'll need easy corner triangles on it, and the center checkerboard will need to be a square. So I'll start out with that first. So just like anything, you just put two pieces right sides together, and this line right here is where your 1/4 inch seam is. And I just follow that line. I don't really cover it up, and just kind of follow down the center. And I like having my pieces laid out on the design board so I know exactly what I need to sew where and to what side. I like to chain piece as much as I possibly can. And to save on thread and to save on time, I usually have a few extra squares of something that I sew together for a different project, something I like to call bonus quilt. So I'll just put those two together, and then I can just snip off my chain right here, cut them apart. I'm going to press these before I add the squares onto the end. And one of the things I do for my small blocks is I press my seams open. That helps me to get them accurate. Because notice when you press your seams to one side, if you were to press this seam to one side, it really has a lot of bulk right there. And if you do that over and over again within your block, you lose some of your measurement. If you press your seams open, it takes just a second and you get used to it. I usually open it and kind of run my finger along. Once the seams are open, I come back out here, lay it on my design board so that I know exactly, again, where they need to go and what piece needs to sew to what piece, so that I will save mistakes. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. If you've never used my guide before, once you tape it onto your machine, just maybe sew a little test seam and measure that it's a 1/4 inch so that you can kind of see where you need to keep your eye. Each machine is a little bit different. But I like how it adds the elongated table here too, and I made it curved so that the corners don't pull on my pieces. Then I'll just grab another square. You could just simply use just a piece of fabric and use the same one over and over again to run under here in between. But I like to use these for another project, like I said, so I just keep them under the machine. Stops your threads from jamming up when you start sewing. And that piece, I don't worry about pressing it yet or anything, I just set it aside. Another great thing about pressing your seams open is you don't have to worry about which side to press them to as pertaining to the next piece you're going to be sewing it to. You don't have to press one to one side and the other to the other side because they're all open, and so they're all just going to go together. And once I've pressed, lay it back out so that I know what goes to what. So now I know I'm going to add these two together. Now when you're at the machine, you just look at the side here and make sure your seams line up. If you're worried about it, you can pin it right there. I don't really do that unless I really have to, especially on these short seams right here. I just hold it, sew into one seam, and then I worry about the next one. I pull or push my fabric either on top or on bottom according to what I need to, so that those butt up right next to each other like that. You'd be surprised how much thread this saves by sewing these starters and stoppers. If you just pulled out your thread and started clipping it, that's thread you could have had sewn into a seam, so that's why I do it this way. Hurry and press this open. And when I say press, see how I just kind of use the edge of the iron to get in there, and then I press. I try not to iron back and forth so that I don't distort my blocks. That's nice and flat. I like to use an old iron because it gets super hot. Then I'm just going to add the other side to the checkerboard. When I sew, I also like to use an open-toed foot so that I can see exactly where my needle is going down this little foot on this featherweight. It just has a little opening in the center, so I like to see exactly where my needle is going. Okay, so now that that's right where it's supposed to be, I'll press that open, and then I'll tell you about my little pressing trick. So a lot of times after pressing this, I'll take a small design board, and while it's still warm and still hot, I'll just like put that on the design board, place a ruler there, and put something heavy on it for a second. And that will actually, when it cools off, it'll set the seams, you know, so that they're flat. And I do that on blocks that are really intricate. I probably normally wouldn't do it on this block, but I wanted to show you my little trick. And when there's something that's a lot of seams going every which way, I do that, and it really helps to keep it flat. So the next section, I want to show you my easy corner triangles. So on the, you need one on this corner and one on this corner. So I'm going to chain piece all four of these by just first grabbing a square and lining up from corner to corner. I'm going to stitch from here to here. And I don't have to mark because I now have a center line. If you don't have a guide, you can pencil it by marking with a ruler from here to here with the pencil. But this saves a lot of time by just making sure this is all lined up evenly, starting right here, and then I just have to watch this corner as it goes along here, and I sew. And it turns out perfectly every time. So I have to do one side before I can do the other easy corner triangle. So I'm just going to put all four of these through. I typically do it on the same side every time. So when I cut these apart, all I need to do is trim off the excess of this little corner right here. So I typically use bigger scissors for that. And I just kind of guess a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Doesn't need to be an exact 1/4 inch because it's already sewn. best way about doing this method is, if you've ever cut a triangle, you know that it stretches out easily because it's on the bias. But this way you sew first, and then you cut, and so it won't stretch out. And so then I just bring them over to the ironing board, and I press these open as well. If it's a bigger block, sometimes I'll just press towards the triangle, but I'm going to press this whole block open just so that you can see how the seams come together and how much easier it is. And I've made quilts my whole life, a lot of quilts, and I've never had any quilts come undone, so you don't have to worry about pressing the seams open. I just use a nice regular stitch. I don't back stitch or anything. I just, remember, this is just first piecing together. They get quilted after and everything. I've never had one pop open. I use good strong thread. So then all I have to do is bring these back over. I can leave them in a stack and just sew the other end, the other side, excuse me. And just start on the corner. But you can see why I had to do one side first, because you have to trim it and press it before you can add the other corner. You can use a little mat and a rotary cutter to trim these off if you'd like, but I typically just have a pair of scissors to the side and clip off the excess. Again, when I'm pressing seams open, I kind of use the edge of the iron to get it open. And then once the seam is open, I press down flat on it. I like to stack them on top of each other too, and that helps when they're cooling off to kind of go flat. Okay, so now this section is going to be laid back out on your board. The checkerboard section is dry and flat by now, so that goes in the center there. And now I just have to make these into squares. I need to put easy corner triangles on both of these. And you just look at your patterns, grab your square, look at your pattern so that you can see which direction that it needs to go. I can see from my pattern that I need to sew from here to here, and it's going to be the same on all 4 of these sections. It's going to be the same direction. And typically, to test that out, you just lay it on there, lining up the pieces this way, and then look at your direction, which you need to go, kind of unfold it if you have to, just to kind of see, yes, that's the way it needs to go, so that you need to sew from this point to this point instead of this point to that point. And then once you start putting them through the machine, you can see to do them all the same. I'm going to go ahead and take these longer ones, look at my pattern, and see which direction that needs to go. And it needs to go from here to here. So I lay it on my machine. And again, since they're all the same way, I only have to remember that once, and then I just copy the other 3. So I clip all these at the same time before I can get them over to my iron after trimming. So I like to use larger scissors for this step because you don't have to be great big, but I don't like to use the little embroidery scissors, so I can do it faster. These longer blades. Okay, so then you're going to bring them back to your design board and lay them back out, each piece, so you can see what it's supposed to look like. And make sure you have each one going the right direction. You don't have to unsew and all of that stuff you need to check on before you go to sew them together. Okay, so once you have them laid out, you can see that that's... So now we're going to sew this to this, and then we'll be able to sew that section after pressing them open to that section. When I'm starting to sew and I have a seam here on the corner and just a straight, I like to start on that end first and make sure that it's nice and flat so that I can put it under the machine, and that's where it really helps with this having previous fabric before. It helps to just butt it right up next to that, and your machine doesn't want to chew on the edges. Nothing to trim here. We're finished with the easy corner triangles. Just need to press them open. Now this one you would have a choice whether you can press it this way or you can press them open, but it works just as well open so that when they butt up against another seam. Like I say, bigger blocks, sometimes I choose and choose not to press them open, but smaller blocks I always press open. That helps so much with the accuracy. It helps to have a nice good iron. I use a dry iron. I don't use steam like I said before when we were talking about the cutting. At this point, you do not want to add moisture to your block in steam or by starch or anything, even though it's very tempting because you want to get those seams flat. But we're working with 100% cotton, so when you add that to your cotton fabric, you add anything moist at all, any moisture at all, and then you add heat to it, it's going to shrink up your piece. And a lot of times, if your block was supposed to be like 6 inches, it'll be, 5 7/8 or something like that, and 6 inches one way or something because it's been distorted by shrinking. So I like to apply that before the pieces are cut out. So now all I have left to do is sew these segments together, and then I'll have 9 squares, basically a 9 patch that I can just sew together just like I did the checkerboard. And again, I line up my edges of fabric, and then I'll line this up at the end where it's supposed to go. And that's typically what I do. I usually don't pin on these short pieces unless I have to. I'm really worried about a section going together or matching up. Then I'll pull out my pins, but for right now I know that as long as I start with the edges even and end with the edges even, then I just kind of ease it in between. Okay, so these 4 sections are now squares that we just need to press open. Okay, so now we have these 4 pressed, and we're going to lay them back out on the design board. When you lay them out, this corner right here always goes on the outside corner, so that helps for placement, so that you know you have them turned the right direction. And then all we have to do next is sew this one here, this one here, this one here. Then I'll go ahead and sew them to the other side in a strip, press the seams open, and almost to the end. This one I'm going to choose to have the patchwork piece up so that I can watch these seams and make sure I'm not sewing them closed. Now that I just took so long to press them open, I don't want to sew them closed. I always start by just sewing a little bit in the beginning and then lining up the top and just making everything as straight as I can. This little easy corner triangle has a little teeny piece left over, so I just kind of ignore that. Use my straight line on my guide to help me to know which is straight so that I don't sew crooked. And then I'm just going to cut off that end, match that up, and start to sew this way. You can trim them all apart and lay them out on the design board if you want, but at this step I pretty much know which one goes to what, so because this is the center piece when I open it, so I know this one goes to that side. And the last one. Press all the seams open. Okay, we're almost there. Just have to sew the 3 rows together and our block is finished. Bring it back over, smooth it out on the design board. First checkerboard star is complete.